first. First of all, of course, I'm delighted to be here. I'm glad I didn't have to fly, trying to keep my carbon footprint small. But yeah, no, I have found over this rather difficult year that Zoom actually works really, really well. May I also just say how pleased I was that you used the jacket blurb from Blaise Aguirre Iorca. As you probably know, he's kind of an archduke at Google, but he's also really a polymath. And he and I have talked about these issues quite a lot in Seattle. And I think he absolutely nailed much of what is the kind of core of my approach. So having said that, I'm going to share the screen and see what I can do. You may have to talk me through it a little bit. I think we can start like that. Okay, is everybody happy with that? Okay. I'm not quite sure what the title was that I gave you, but this is basically what the story is. This talk is really meant for a very general audience: scientists, psychologists, neurobiologists, geneticists, as well as philosophers, and it turns out lawyers are interested as well. It is a very big story because, as you know, social neuroscience and social psychology have developed enormously in the last 15 years. But in order to do all this in 1 hour, I'm of course going to leave many details aside. So you should feel free to ask me about some of the details in the question period, and I will be only too happy to talk further. And I have this image of the orangutan and the dog because orangutans, although they are loners in the wild, have the same kind of social circuitry as all primates. We are all deeply social. And he was at a rescue center when this dog came in. And as you can see, the two of them are very close, and they bonded, and they've been attached ever since. So let's go straight to it. Now I'm going to start with Ed Wilson, because in 1975, Ed made this observation, which is that the evolution of human sociality is the fundamental conundrum of biology. Now, why did he say that actually? So here is the account. First of all, we all know that the deepest level of value for all organisms has to do with their well-being, their survival, and the ability to reproduce. That is the value that is hardwired into the circuitry itself. And because self-care and self-orientedness is so important for so many organisms, evolutionary biologists came to the view that sociality, and in particular altruism, could not emerge in the normal evolutionary way. And that is because if there was a mutation and a person appeared who was altruistic in the sense that they incurred a cost to themselves in order to benefit others, they would soon be exploited by the other selfish guys and it would be wiped out. So the argument, and Richard Dawkins advanced this argument in The Selfish Gene, was that we have to teach altruism because we are born selfish. To a degree he was right, and to a degree he was wrong. And so that really is the essence of the story. Now in 1871, Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, he asked, where does our moral sense or our conscience come from? And Darwin proposed 3 components: interactive. There are social instincts which motivate us to be social. There are habits and skills which we acquire postnatally. And I don't just mean humans, I mean all social animals, which we acquire postnatally in order to navigate our social world. And thirdly, there is problem solving, which is an issue when, for example, the ecology changes and certain norms have to be modified or certain proposals have to be put in place in order for group survival to continue. So 3 components. Now, for those of you who are philosophers, you will recognize these 3 components as being, where are we here? This is not working. Okay. Now, why are my slides not advancing?
I think there's an advance button near the bottom of the slide.
Well, that's the thing that, down here. Okay, hang on. We've got a little, okay, there we go. Well,
Yeah.
Did you advance the slide?
No, I haven't.
You haven't. Oh, I got you. Okay, yeah, this is slightly different. Okay. You will recognize that this really resonates, of course, with what Aristotle said, and also Confucius, David Hume, and Adam Smith. None of these guys, incidentally, fell for we've got to have rules and the rules have to be beaten into people. Not one of them. Interesting. So let's see where this takes us. So what sciences are teaching us about morality? And I think this is an especially important question for philosophers to consider. And the answer is a lot. Genetics, experimental psychology, especially developmental psychology. And here I would like to mention the fellow Canadian Alison Gopnik, who has done brilliant work on development of social behavior in children. There, of course, is ethology, where people study animal behavior both in the wild and in captivity. The stars are by neuroscience and neuroendocrinology, because that is what I shall focus on, but I will advert to some of the other sciences. Now, ethology has been particularly important, and Frans de Waal has been leader here in observation of animal behavior. These are chimpanzees, and it certainly looks like a familiar kind of social behavior. And what de Waal and his colleagues have found is that in the wild, as well as in captivity, amongst primates, but amongst other social animals like wolves, we see consolation after a loss, reconciliation after a defeat, pro-social choice, such as sharing food, orphan adoption, a major cost to incur to oneself in order to help others. There are 5 instances of orphan adoption amongst male chimpanzees who were discovered to have no genetic connection to the orphans they adopted. We see empathy, we see third-party punishment, a sense of what constitutes fairness. We see self-control, cooperation, and reasoning. Yes, humans are different, but the old story that humans alone have these social skills and these social functions turns out to be quite wrong. I also want in this slide just to remind you that, of course, humans didn't come from chimpanzees directly. And in this slide, on the vertical axis, you're seeing years in millions. And on the horizontal axis, you're seeing spatial spread, inaccurately represented, but there it is. And what you will notice is that here, look at Homo erectus, was around for about 1.8 million years, lived in small groups of, we believe, about 30 to 50 to a little bit more, depending on resources. They had controlled use of fire. They almost certainly had a kind of language. And here's us up here. We've only been around for about 300,000 years, and we certainly have strong genetic connections both to Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, as well as some more ancient guys. So again, I read some of the older philosophers who say, humans are utterly unique. Well, yeah, in certain ways, because we're hairless, for example, but in social behavior, not. Now, of course, we see sociality across taxa. Famously, and this was part of what drew me to Ed Wilson, of course, was that he did this brilliant work on social insects. But we know that social insects are really quite different in their behavior from social mammals. And that is that their behavior is very strongly limited genetically. They have less flexibility, shall we say, than mammals do. Now, the question is, why do mammals have this flexibility in social behavior that is quite different from what we see, say, in reptiles or in insects? And the answer seems to be this in evolutionary terms. About 200 million years ago, something really astonishing happened on the planet. And that was that very tiny animals are warm-blooded. And this was a tremendous advantage because endotherms can forage at night when the other guys are waiting for the sun to come up. It was a terrific advantage. They could also forage in climates that were closed to cold-blooded animals. Now, as always in evolution, there is a cost. And this is really important. The cost is this: gram for gram, a warm-blooded animal has to eat 10 times as much as its cold-blooded cousin. And that puts a huge ecological constraint on the success of warm-blooded animals. So what did Mother Nature do? Basically, Mother Nature said, well, if I may be anthropomorphic for a moment, there's really only one way to do this in real time, and that is to make the warm-blooded animals smart so that once they're born, their brains can tune themselves up to the environment in a very, very rich and profound way. So that will give them the advantage that will overcome their deep caloric needs. And so we see the emergence of a structure that is unique to mammals. And let me say a bit of this structure is also in birds, but let me just stick with mammals. And that is cortex. You have it, every single mammal has it, and it looks the same essentially in every single mammal. And on the left, what you're looking at is the cortex is this purple structure, like the rind of an orange on the outside of the brain. Now, when you look more closely under a microscope, you see that it has this highly, highly structured 5-6 layer organization. Every mammal has that, and it looks the same essentially in all mammals. Primates have a higher density of neurons, but the neuronal types are essentially organized in exactly the same way. Well, what's so great about that? Well, here's the thing. When you're born, your cortex is very, very immature. The wiring is, you have some neurons there, but the wiring is not really set up. And so in this old slide, you can see neurons in cortex in the newborn, and they have very little in the way of dendritic organization and just a little bit in the way of axonal. But look at it at 1 month, at 9 months, at 2 years. It is estimated that 1 million synapses, neuron to neuron connections, are made per second in the developing human brain. So Mother Nature had stumbled on an information processor, or whatever you want to call it, that was very, very powerful. And here I'm just reminding you that this immaturity is essentially true of all mammals, and it's essentially true of all birds. And you can see in these neonate rats, they're hairless, they're blind, they can't do much. The circuitry that they have is not cortical, but it's subcortical, and it allows them to move around, find something warm, and suck on it. And that's it. And human babies are, of course, very helpless as well. So here's the thing. In the evolution of endotherms, warm-blooded animals, learning capacity goes way up, and that provides them an advantage. The disadvantage is neonatal independence goes way down. So now Mother Nature has another problem. So here you can see a turtle comes out of his egg, mother's nowhere around, he gets himself down to the water and swims off. Not so with the baby chimpanzee. So how does Mother Nature solve the problem of neonatal dependence? And conceptually what happens, and we'll talk about the wiring and the neurobiology in a minute, but conceptually what happens is Mother Nature said to herself, well, look, I got all this circuitry in there for self-care. Why don't I just make some modifications to the circuitry so that the behavior for self-care expands to include babies, other care. And so we see that there is an expansion from me to me and mine. Now think about Dawkins when he says that we are all born selfish. Okay, so all right, so how does Mother Nature achieve this? And the answer is very, very complicated. There are many, many neurochemicals involved, but one that's particularly important for attachment between parent and offspring is oxytocin, and I'm sure you know that. And so when the baby is born, there is a rush of oxytocin in the mother's brain. And when the baby and the mother cuddle, there is a rush of oxytocin in both brains. Now, I should just say that oxytocin is a super ancient molecule, long predating. We see versions of it in insects. So what else does it do in the human body? And the answer is quite a lot. It's essential for milk ejection during lactation. It's also essential for contraction of the uterus during birth. It does all kinds of other things in the body. It's found both in the testes and the ovaries. It's found in the gut, in the kidneys, and in the heart. So in the brain, it has a very special role. Okay, where does oxytocin come from? Now, what you're looking at on the left-hand side of the screen is a sketch of a brain. This little thing here shown in green is part of a very ancient structure in the brain called the hypothalamus. And from the hypothalamus are projections to many other areas. For example, to the hippocampus, to the amygdala, which processes various kinds of emotions, the nucleus accumbens, which processes positive reactions, and the bed nucleus of the striae terminalis, don't remember that if you don't feel like it, which processes negative emotions. And oxytocin is released from the hypothalamus to all of these regions. And what we are beginning now to understand is what it does for social behavior when it does project to those regions. And on the right-hand side, you're really just looking at the blow up of the hypothalamus. And you'll notice that there are projections into the brain, but notice there are projections into the pituitary and down into the body, which is how you get oxytocin when you need it to deliver a baby, and the uterus gets it. Okay, so let me just go back to that for a moment. So for a long time, this has been known about oxytocin. But, you know, people, including me, I say philosophers, but not only, said, well, you know, this is just about mothers and babies. What's that got to do with morality? Which, of course, we know is a very highfalutin thing that involves reason. And some people thought, you know, I bet there's more to the story than that. And it turns out that there is, that this is actually, this extension from me to me and mine is the beginning of the development of a variety of forms of sociality. How did we come to know that? And that story now, this is one of my favorite stories, the biology, has to do with the voles. So as good Canadians, you will know there are many species of vole. And the montane voles live in the mountains and they build their nests under rocks. The male and the female montane vole meet, they mate, and then they go their separate ways. Prairie voles are very different. It's genetically so similar, and yet they're different. They meet, they mate, and now they're bonded forever. And what does that mean in a vole? It means, for example, that the male, shown here, huddles over the babies, takes care of them, guards the nest against other females as well as other males. They live in a large community where there's lots of vole homes scattered about. And the siblings, when these guys grow up, they are going to help with the next litter. You don't see anything like that in montane voles. So the question is, what's the difference in the brain? And here, Larry Young, who's at Emory University, was the first one to really identify the difference. Now, what you're looking at here, OTR means oxytocin receptor. So just as a bit of background, I'm sure you know this, is that a neurochemical can't do anything unless on a neuron there sits a receptor to which it binds, as a result of which something changes in the neuron. So we're very interested in receptors, oxytocin receptors and vasotocin receptors. Oxytocin and vasopressin probably were one thing at one point in our evolutionary history and then diverged. Genetically very similar. So now we're going to look at the brains of montane voles and prairie voles. And so in order to detect the presence of oxytocin receptors, you have to stain for a particular protein that is the receptor. So that stain will show up dark here. So look at this little region in the prairie vole, the nucleus accumbens, which is important for reward, for positive feelings of reward. And what you see is that there is a very high density of receptors for oxytocin, but not so in the montane vole. And for vasopressin down here in the lower panel, you see there's a very high density of receptors for vasopressin in the ventral pallidum, also part of the reward system, but not in the montane vole. So then, of course, they did all the manipulations. You know, you block receptors in the prairie vole. Do they still mate for life? No. And if you do a genetic change in a solitary mouse species, do they become social? Yes. So the manipulations were done. And increasingly, it looked like oxytocin played a super important role, not just in mother-baby attachment, but in attachment to mates. And then the question was, well, wait, what about if you don't have attachment to mates, but you have attachment to kin? As for example, in baboons, Hamadryas baboons, where there are matrilines, and the strong attachments are between mother and daughter, and her daughter, and her daughter, and so forth. And what about just attachments with friends, as we see with chimpanzees and bonobos and humans? And the answer seems to be that Mother Nature can tweak the density and location of oxytocin receptors, and you get various different forms of social attachment. And this was, when I first heard the story about the prairie voles, it seemed to me that it was just one of the most exciting things I'd ever heard, because I could begin to see what was going to be the account of the biological platform. Now, this doesn't tell us anything about norms yet, and I will get to norms, but it does tell us why we are socially motivated at all. And part of the answer is we have the circuitry for it. We find social interactions, positive ones, rewarding. I'll have much more to say about this. This is just to remind me to tell you, this is a sketch of a rat brain, and what we're looking at are a variety of ancient structures. And in the reward system, the ventral tegmental area, and there's our old friend, the nucleus accumbens. So it isn't just a story about oxytocin, but about the endogenous opioids that make us feel good. So one of the things that happens in a rewarding situation, for example, when mother and baby are cuddling, oxytocin is released into the VTA and in the nucleus accumbens, and so are endocannabinoids, and we feel good. All right, simple story. And I know that it's more complex than that, but we'll get to the complexities in God's good time. One of the discoveries, which I found really quite interesting, came from Oxytocin's lab, which was that there are specialized receptors in the skin, which nobody had really seen before, which are related to skin touch. And you saw that picture of the dad vole over the baby voles being touched and cuddled. Skin to skin contact is extremely important. And these specialized receptors carry signals of a touch, about 7 hertz touch. They carry those signals to the brain, and they also play an important role in sociality. All right, that story in and of itself is really fun and exciting. Recently, another discovery was made about the human brain and sociality. So this is a sketch of a human brain, and as you all know, the visual cortex is here at the back. V1 is here, and you know that there is a dorsal pathway that is preferentially for information about where things are, and a ventral pathway which is preferential, and I'm not saying only for, preferential for objects, but here is a pathway nobody had really seen before because I hadn't tested it. And in this pathway, the neurons are specialized for social interactions, positive or negative, when an individual is smiling, or when a dog is growling, or when a dog is lunging forward. These neurons are highly active. So there's a tremendous importance on identifying social behavior of others. And that too is a whole exciting story in and of itself. So there are highly social mammals and some that are not so social. But basically what we can see then is evolutionarily, we start with a simple focus on oneself, but then that can expand to me and kin, and it can also expand from me to kin and to kith, to friends and acquaintances and the wider community. I also, I don't really think I need to show you this, but yeah, because we kind of did it before, but this is the area in the hypothalamus that secretes oxytocin, goes to the reward system, to areas that are important for fear, and of course to the nucleus accumbens, which is very rewarding. Now, this is a slide that really tries to say the story in a very simple way. And that is that sociality, as given the wiring that we are born with, sociality begets other caring, as with mother baby, as with father baby, as with mates, as with kin. Other caring together with social learning begets social norms for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, what's right and what's wrong. And problem solving in an ecology begets norm changes, where individuals begin to see that there might be better ways of handling certain kinds of social problems. And this really is an echo, as you can see, of the Darwinian point that there are social instincts, there are habits and skills, and there is reasoning. Now, of course, it's a very complex story about learning norms, and all social mammals do learn how to navigate their social sphere, their social world. And the important part of the story, you might think, well, this is where reasoning comes in. This is where Kant and others are important. No. The important part of the story here is actually the reward system, which turns out, despite what early psychologists thought, the reward system is immensely complex, very, very subtle, entirely capable of learning things that are very complex but become habits or become skills, where you don't have to figure out from scratch what to do. And we see this actually in all primates, that there that the young learn the ways of getting on in their social group. But the story is complex, or as Blaise Aguirre Iyarka would say, it's messy, it's dirty, and it is. And that's just kind of our lot in life. The thing is that norms sometimes conflict with preferences, norms conflict with other norms, norms vary across individuals, within an individual as you develop, as you age. Sometimes, and it's a very interesting question, how relevant memories are retrieved so that relative to a particular dilemma, humans and other animals are able to draw on the relevant past experiences where something similar happened. And that's what we do. We think, oh yes, this is like the time when, and we draw on that and we come to make our decision. What we don't do, I'm sorry, Immanuel Kant, is invoke the categorical imperative. I don't think Kant himself ever probably really did. Certainly I never did. So oxytocin has sometimes been called the love molecule. I mention that only because that's a really, really stupid thing to say. So don't call it the love molecule. And I'll tell you in a few moments why. But part of the reason is that there is this, and this was discovered very early on actually, is that there is, to a first approximation, a kind of counterbalance between stress and relaxation. And neurobiologically, what that means is this, is that when oxytocin levels go up, stress hormones, namely cortisol, goes down. And when cort goes up, oxytocin goes down. And so part of the reason that touch and sociality and so forth feel good to us is that it sends cort levels down. Stress and anxiety decrease. The other reason, and this is actually a fairly recent discovery made by people at University of California, Davis, and that is this, that you saw that oxytocin could be released into the reward system, into the nucleus accumbens. It can also be released into this long-winded name, the bed nucleus of the striae terminalis. Now, when you have a positive reaction, somebody says something nice about you and pats you on the back and gives you a hug, that's the nucleus accumbens that gets fired up. When somebody says something nasty to you or shoves you or does something mean, oxytocin goes to the bed nucleus of the striae terminalis, and oxytocin has the opposite effect. It makes you avoid, not approach. So bed nucleus of the striae terminalis gives you avoidance behavior in a social context, whereas nucleus accumbens gives you approach behavior in a social context. Now, nobody said it was simple, but it is kind of a cool story. One of the things that's so interesting is that food sharing, whether it's in chimpanzees or capuchin monkeys or in humans, when food is shared, oxytocin levels go up. All right. Now, I did say that I thought genetics was really important, and there are many, many ways in which the genetic story is very important. People, of course, are looking at single polymorphisms in the gene for the oxytocin receptor. But here's a story that I think is really important. We'll go back to that. So this was done by Perkybile in 2018 and 19. So let's start here. And this is an experiment involving mice. So the female mice have lots of babies. And so we're going to do the usual control experiment. But in the experimental part, we're going to remove the babies from the mom, keep them warm and fed and so forth. And at night, they do go back. So they aren't entirely without parental care. Now, one of the things that's important in mice, and you see this also in dogs, is licking and licking and grooming and grooming. And it's not unlike what parents do with human babies. They cuddle and they rock and they do all these things. So the experimental mice are not getting much in the way of parental care, not much in the way of licking and grooming. So you look at the, you look at the genes, and what do you see? You see methylation of the histones related to the genes for, guess what? The oxytocin receptor. Well, what does the methylation do? It shuts down the production of the oxytocin receptor, which means that you have decreased gene expression for the oxytocin receptor, which means that in the brain of these mice who are not cuddled, not groomed, not licked, there are fewer oxytocin receptors in the brain, which means that you've got, remember we talked about how important it is to have a receptor for the oxytocin to bind to if the oxytocin is going to do anything. Fewer receptors for oxytocin, what does that do? It gives you atypical social behavior. Very important. So what happens, what's an instance, you might ask, of atypical social behavior? And the answer is, when these baby females grow up and have their own babies, they're very poor mothers. They don't lick, they don't groom, they basically don't care. All right. And because I, of course, like all good Canadians, I'm fascinated by wolves and wolf behavior. Wolves are really interesting because they are intensely social, and because their sociality, as we all know if we have dogs, is very subtle, very complicated. They quickly learn how to predict exactly what the other wolf is going to do from the tiniest bit of behavior. And you can see how they've positioned themselves here. And I'm afraid that this moose cow and her calf are for it. They will watch, they will call, they will whistle. This guy will rip out the tendon, this guy will rip out the throat, and all will be well. Now, cooperation then is one of the really, really astonishing things that you see in wolves. And again, you know, just to sort of get a common theme that bothers me is that there has been this tradition of saying only humans really cooperate. And it's just not true. But of course, humans are very cooperative. And we don't need to dwell on that, but it's wonderful. Now, I think I've got time to introduce another aspect that really surprised me. And this involves telling you about a very important experiment that was very carefully done, but that I didn't believe until I went through this paper many times and talked to the authors many times. And now I get it. The question that was asked is this: does temperament, which we think of as essentially plus or minus a bit, a lifelong feature, does temperament play some role in political preferences and hence in moral decisions? And political scientists in particular have noticed, of course, that there are differences in political ideology. And the question was, are they related to, you know, being nonchalant or being highly anxious? Now, John Hibbing, just before I get to this, John Hibbing is a political scientist at Nebraska. And he and his colleagues were really interested in whether temperament and character, you might say, played any role in political preferences. And they did behavioral experiments where, for example, you would present a whole lot of images to people, and you would record eye movements and the duration of focusing or fixating on particular images. And they had noticed that people who scored on the ideological surveys, where they scored very extreme on the right or very extreme on the left, had quite different eye scan patterns given these images. But you know, that's just behavior. And John Hibbing, It's sort of a soulmate in as much as, behavior really isn't enough. You really want to know what's going on in the brain. So he approached Reed Montague, who is a neuroscientist at Virginia Tech. And he said, I want to know what's going on in the brains of individuals when they look at different kinds of pictures. So the experiment, and you can see here is the scanner. The experiment has three components. First of all, people are put in the MR scanner, and they had, I think, 183 subjects. So that's a heck of a lot of scanning. And they're shown pictures. Neutral, very unpleasant, disgusting, and threatening. All right. And you want to have an introspective report later when they're out of the scanner and they see those pictures again. What did you feel about this picture? And finally, a survey on political ideology. And there's really well-tested surveys that they use that are about as good as you get, at least at this stage. Okay, so what did they find? And this just shows you what it's like in the scanner. There's a threatening picture, a pleasant picture, and then just a plus sign here to make sure that the person is still focusing and not drifting off into sexual fantasies or something. And then finally, a disgusting picture. And these are just randomly presented. And then there's the subjective ratings, and finally there's the surveys. Okay, so here is an example. This is actually John Hibbing with worms in the mouth, and this is alleged to be disgusting. And so the question is, what do the brain scans show? Now, this is a slightly complicated figure. So what I want you to do is, first of all, just look up at A. And what you're looking on the vertical axis is signal change. That is, are you getting higher levels of activity or are you getting lower levels of activity? And what you're looking at in red are the levels of activity averaged across conservatives at the extreme end. And liberals are in turquoise down here. And so basically, area under the curve is 0.845. So here we have, and this is a summary of what you're looking at in C, and I'll take you through C in a minute. So it looks like in the regions below, namely this region, this region, this region, that what you're looking at is higher levels of activity in those regions for people who score on the extreme end. Now, two things. One is, this was only to the disgusting pictures. It was not to neutral, and it was not to threatening. Only disgusting. Worms in the mouth, for example. Now, what are these regions that are averaged such that you get this representation in A? So there is the thalamus here. There is frontal structures, the dorsolateral prefrontal structures, and you can see that's quite a big effect, all right? So the dorsolateral prefrontal structures right here. And we know that those are very important for so-called executive function, whatever the heck that really is. Frontal eye fields. Now, amygdala. Amygdala is important for processing, especially negative, but also positive emotions. And you can see there's quite a significant difference. So when you average all of those together, you get the description in A. Now, the first thing, of course, we all thought was, well, that's a funny kind of area. I mean, look at this. This is pre-motor area. Why are you even seeing effects there? BG is basal ganglia. Why are you seeing effects there? And what we've kind of had to conclude is that whereas people have been very fond of talking about modules for a long time, and they might have thought, there is the ideological module, is nothing like that. These don't constitute any well-known circuitry for anything. But it's a highly repeatable, highly significant finding. Now, so that's one thing. The other thing is, I'll go back. You're going to want to know what were the introspective reports like. So let's go back to worms in the mouth. Did those people who showed high reactivity and who were highly conservative, did they find worms in the mouth upsetting? Some did, some didn't. All right, so let's just move ahead again to this. So you would think that if you are seeing this kind of response from conservatives, they would say, yeah, I found that pretty awful. And that liberals, these are extremes, remember, extreme liberals would say, yeah, it didn't really bother me. The result was completely random. A liberal might say, it didn't really bother me. And yet, or sorry, it really, really bothered me. I found it very offensive, as you know, certain extreme liberals are wont to do. And, but the brain didn't show that. And I think this wasn't expected to be an interesting finding, but as a philosopher, I think it's really interesting. Because we've all known for a very long time, since social psychology has got off the ground, that people's answers as to why they did something often involve confabulation, that they don't represent a deep truth that is accessible only by introspection. People often don't know why they did something. They don't know, for example, in that famous experiment involving pantyhose, where there were 8 pairs of pantyhose put on a table and in a supermarket, and women could come in and, I don't know, guess women, this is an old experiment because women don't seem to wear pantyhose much anymore, but you could look at the table and choose whichever pair you liked, and then they would give it to you. So what did they find? They found that something like 85% of the women chose the pantyhose on the right-hand side. Now, these were identical pantyhose. So when you ask a subject, so why did you choose that? They say, oh, you know, that's really a better color for me than any of the others. These were identical pantyhose. Or it's a level of sheerness that's much better than those others. They are identical pantyhose. Did any woman say, I chose it because it was on the right-hand side? Not a one. So for moral philosophers who think that we always have access to why we did something, I think both this particular result with regard to what we know the brain was doing and what people said their response was, I think that these are real cautionary tales. Now, I'm almost done, but I kind of want to go back to Ed Wilson and the fact that, you know, when you have animals that are much more complex than social insects or social fish, it turns out that they do lots and lots of things that don't necessarily promote their own fitness. They take pleasure, as this monkey obviously is. They take pleasure in being with others, cuddling with others, grooming others, and it doesn't have too much to do with passing on their genes. Now, that's not to say that passing on your genes isn't important. It's just to say that lots of behavior that we engage in has nothing to do with passing on our genes. And that's a really important thing for those philosophers who look to evolutionary psychology and think that they can explain various kinds of norms in behavior. And I think, yeah, that's the last, and that's the cover of the book. Now, I'm sure that there are many, many questions, and I would be more than happy to answer as best I can. Okay, thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Churchland. We really appreciate the excellent presentation. So for anybody who has questions, feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat. If you type in the chat, I'll just read it out.
Okay, it looks like Andrew has a question.
Yes, Andrew.